The first splash of Coca-Cola hit her face so hard that the entire restaurant seemed to go silent. The second soaked through her white shirt, dripping from her hair onto the polished floor. She stood frozen beside table 17, while a room full of wealthy guests stared at her, as if humiliation were part of the evening's entertainment. But nobody knew that the woman standing there, trembling with tears in her eyes, was about to become the one person in the room nobody would ever dare disrespect again. And nobody could have imagined what happened when the restaurant's most powerful investor walked through the doors, looked at the soaked waitress, and quietly called her, "My love." Before we continue, if you believe people deserve second chances and kindness should never depend on someone's social status, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Bright Hearts for more stories about second chances, courage, and unexpected miracles. Her name was Mara, and she had learned early in life that dignity was sometimes something you had to protect with both hands. She was 32, worked double shifts, and lived in a tiny apartment above an old laundromat where the walls shook whenever the machines downstairs went into their spin cycles. She had a younger brother studying nursing, an elderly mother who needed expensive medication, and a kitchen drawer filled with unpaid bills she kept promising herself she would somehow conquer. She never complained at work. She arrived before sunrise, tied her dark hair back, polished every glass until it shone, and remembered the names of regular customers who often forgot hers. To most people, she was simply the waitress in the red vest. But to the few people who truly knew her, she was the woman who had quietly sacrificed almost everything so her family could have a future. That evening, the restaurant was hosting a private celebration for several investors who had helped rescue the struggling hotel from bankruptcy. The dining room glittered beneath golden chandeliers, and expensive perfume floated through the air. Mara had been assigned to the largest table, where a wealthy couple and their friends were drinking heavily and laughing louder with every glass. They treated the staff like furniture. One man snapped his fingers instead of speaking, while the woman beside him complained that the silverware looked cheap. Mara remained polite, even when they mocked her accent and laughed when she accidentally mispronounced the name of a French dessert. She swallowed every insult because she needed the job. Then came the mistake. A young busboy carrying a tray stumbled near their table, and one glass tipped over. A few drops landed on the woman's designer handbag. She erupted as though someone had committed a crime. Mara immediately apologized and reached for a cloth, but the woman slapped her hand away. The restaurant manager hurried over, terrified of losing the wealthy guests. Instead of defending Mara, he blamed her for not paying enough attention. The humiliation burned deeper than the spilled drink. The man at the table leaned back, smiling with the careless confidence of someone who had never been told no. He lifted his glass of Coke and asked Mara whether she thought working in a place like this made her important. She said nothing. She simply lowered her eyes and asked if she could bring them another drink. That answer seemed to amuse him. In one cruel motion, he threw the Coke directly into her face. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Mara could hear the ice cubes sliding across the floor. She could feel the cold liquid running down her cheeks, soaking her collar, dripping from her eyelashes. Someone at another table gasped. Someone else quietly raised a phone. The manager looked horrified, but his eyes went toward the wealthy guests first, as though calculating which side was safer. Mara slowly wiped her face with the back of her hand. Her hands were shaking, but she refused to cry. She thought about her mother waiting at home. She thought about her brother's tuition. She thought about every morning she had gotten out of bed despite exhaustion because somebody depended on her. Then she noticed a young dishwasher watching from the kitchen doorway. He looked frightened because he knew exactly what would happen if she lost her job. So Mara did the hardest thing she had ever done. She stood straight. She told the manager she was going home. She did not scream. She did not insult anyone. She simply untied her apron, placed it neatly on the service counter, and walked toward the exit with Coke still dripping from her clothes. The room remained silent behind her. She had made it almost to the door when the sound of hurried footsteps came from the entrance. A man in a cream-colored suit entered the restaurant carrying a phone in one hand. He was young enough to look out of place among the older investors, yet everyone immediately recognized him. He was Julian Vale, the restaurant's biggest investor, the man whose company had recently purchased a controlling stake in the hotel. His reputation was legendary. He was known for being ruthless in business, impossible to impress, and fiercely protective of people who earned his trust. He stopped when he saw Mara. His expression changed completely. He crossed the room without looking at anyone else, reached her, and gently took the wet cloth from her trembling hand. Then, in front of everyone, he said the words that would be repeated throughout the city the next morning. "My love, what happened to you?" The room seemed to lose all oxygen. Mara stared at him, confused. Julian had known her for years, though not in the way the wealthy guests assumed. Long before he became a famous investor, his father had owned a small grocery store in the neighborhood where Mara grew up. When Julian was 17, his family lost everything after a business partner stole from them. Mara's mother had quietly brought groceries to their apartment for months. She had never asked for payment. She simply told them that one day they would have the chance to help someone else. Julian had never forgotten. Years later, after building his fortune, he had searched for the family that once helped his own. He had found Mara working at the restaurant and discovered that she had been paying her mother's medical bills while secretly helping her brother through school. He had invested in the hotel partly because he knew Mara deserved stability, even though she had never asked him for anything. The wealthy guests suddenly became very quiet. Julian turned toward the table where the Coke had been thrown. He did not shout. He did not need to. He simply asked the manager whether this was how employees were treated under his ownership. The manager's face went pale. Security was called, and the guests were escorted out despite their protests and threats. But Julian did something unexpected. He did not make Mara feel like a victim. He asked her what she wanted. She looked at the floor for several seconds before admitting that she wanted to finish her brother's tuition, pay her mother's medical bills, and someday open a small cafe where nobody would ever be treated badly because they worked behind a counter. Julian smiled. He told her that dreams sounded like a business plan. Months later, the restaurant changed. The manager was replaced. Employees received better wages, paid leave, and a written policy protecting them from abusive customers. And across town, a tiny cafe opened with warm wooden tables, homemade pastries, and a sign above the door that read, "Everyone deserves a seat at the table." Mara owned it. Her brother became a nurse. Her mother recovered enough to sit by the cafe window every morning and watch customers come and go. The dishwasher who had once watched helplessly from the kitchen became the cafe's first employee. And Julian, despite all his wealth, still visited almost every Sunday. He never treated Mara like someone he had rescued. He treated her like someone who had reminded him what success was supposed to mean. One rainy evening, Mara stood outside her cafe and watched an exhausted young waitress from the neighboring restaurant walking home alone. She remembered that terrible night, the cold Coke on her face, the shame, the silence, and the moment someone finally stood beside her. She realized the greatest miracle had not been the investor walking through the door. It had been the fact that she had walked toward the door herself, even when nobody knew what would happen next. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes kindness still matters, and subscribe to Bright Hearts. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need a little hope on their hardest day. And before the story ends, I want you to leave one special comment. Right? Kindness always comes back. If you believe that how we treat people matters more than money, titles, or status. Years later, when people asked Mara how she built a successful cafe from nothing, she never mentioned the investor, the money, or the night that changed her life. She always gave the same answer. She said that sometimes life breaks your heart in front of a room full of strangers, only to teach you that your worth was never in their hands. And somewhere in that crowded little cafe, beneath the warm lights and the sound of people laughing together, Mara finally understood something she had forgotten during all those difficult years. Being humiliated did not make her small. Surviving it made her stronger. Standing up made her powerful. And choosing kindness after being treated cruelly made her unforgettable. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the person carrying the most beautiful story. And sometimes, the moment you think your dignity has been taken from you is actually the moment you discover that nobody can ever take it away.